Hi there. This is Joe Firestone with the In Depth Show, and I'm here tonight for New Macro Media. And what I want to talk about is the ideology checker. That's right. Okay. I don't want to talk about the fact checker. I do want to talk about Glenn Kessler of the Washington Post. He calls himself a fact checker, but I think that he's clearly, an ideology checker, because a fact checker would not act in the way that he acts. So, the first thing to say about he, and I think also a number of other fact checkers as well, who come from the mainstream, is that they've constituted themselves as a means of checking out the lies that incessantly come from politicians, and especially from the administration in power right now, the Trump administration. It's quite a job keeping track of those lies, and it's quite a job trying to establish that their fact checking is not actually fake news. Because what does Trump actually mean by fake news? He means interpretations of what he claims and what he says that disagree with his interpretations. And what they mean are interpretations of what he says, but concerning the world, from their perspectives, and not from his perspective. And of course, they implicitly or even explicitly assume that their perspective is somehow an objective perspective, and that therefore their perspective is the right one and his perspective is the wrong one, and therefore that he is lying but they are not. And don't get me wrong, I do think that Trump is lying, and he lies most of the time, and I don't think it's simply a matter of the perspective. I think he's consciously trying not to tell the truth. But I also think that many of his critics and many of the fact checkers, so called, quote unquote, when they encounter factual claims that disagree with their own factual claims, somehow evaluate or decide the factual claims of others they are seeing based on their own ideological perspective, and that they normally don't actually create a distance between the ideological judgments they're making about the factual claims and actual legitimate criticisms of those claims that most everybody who was trying to be honest would grant. In other words, there is a way to objectivity, in the only sensible way we can understand that term or that sort of claim. And that way to objectivity is through criticism, okay, of claims, and bringing the strongest criticisms of claims that you can possibly bring, but bring those criticisms from an honest perspective, not from a personal perspective, not giving priority or primacy to your personal perspective as far as you are able to do that. You want to consider alternative criticisms, okay, of factual claims. The strongest criticisms that you can consider of those particular claims. Okay. And then you want to decide among them by keeping your distance from what your own perspective is, insofar as you are able to do that. Now, people who can work that way may justly be called fact checkers. But people who work from their own ideological perspectives and who seem to always give primacy to their own ideological perspectives are not being objective analysts. They are not being objective evaluators. They're not really attempting to do fact checking. What they're doing is checking from the viewpoint of their own ideological presuppositions, their own value presuppositions. And they're not entertaining other perspectives. They're not entertaining other perspectives as potentially valid. They're not engaging in fair comparison of other perspectives with their own perspectives, okay, in order to arrive at their interpretations of what the facts really are. So, there was an article that recently appeared in The Intercept. It was written, the article was written by Ryan Grim, a very good writer for The Intercept, a very skillful writer and a skillful critic, okay, as well, and generally fair-minded. And he wrote a very good critique of the kinds of fact checks often performed by Glenn Kessler of the Washington Post. And not only of Kessler's critiques, but also of the newspaper's interpretations of the criticisms of those critiques and the complaints about those critiques that often pop up. So now I'm going to go to the article by Ryan Grim and go through part of it, at least with you, and show you what I mean. And then I'm going to go through some of the implications, okay, of that. Let me shift my view. So here's the article by Grimm in The Intercept. The title of it is Washington Post has nominated Glenn Kessler for a Pulitzer Prize, which, by the way, he did not win. But let us now go further, and I'll go through at least a part of the article with you. So let me take a look first. And see who's here. Hi, Dolores. And also Elizabeth Bergen. Nice to see you here. And Dolores Pierce. And Steve Wolfbrandt. Oh, Dolores has an echo. So I see I have to turn things down again. Let me do that and see if I can get rid of the echo. Somewhat. I may also have an echo because there. I had the sound on the page. Maybe now the echo is less pronounced than it was. Hi, Dave Phelps. Dave Phelps has joined also. And Randy Hedgebeth. It's nice to see you here. And Linda Littleton Gray has joined. It's nice to see you, Linda. And also Mr. Rushford, Jim Rushford, has joined. Okay, and Dolores says it sounds better. Thank you, Dolores. I hope it's good enough now to watch. Let me go back to the article here. Share that with you. Make sure that you're seeing that. Yes, you are seeing that. Okay, let me go through it. So the Washington Post has nominated Glenn Kessler and his fact checker team for the 2019 Pulitzer Prize in the National Reporting category, but Kessler was not named as a finalist, which meant that the nomination was never actually made public, but the Post's editor, Mr. Marty Baron, confirmed the nomination. The thrust of it focused on Kessler's work, debunking the many lies of Donald Trump, and hung on a September piece that marked the 5,000th false or misleading claim by Donald Trump. So anyway, there are many hate readers of Kessler's work, and they probably were reveling in the idea that he did not get a Pulitzer. Okay, and Grimm points out that their joy at what happened was like a punchline to a cruel joke, but it also helps explain why the Post has so consistently stood by the operation, the Kessler fact checker operation, even in the face of savage criticism over the years from Democrats who have pointed out repeated factual errors in his fact checks. The outcry from the left is not cause for concern. Instead, it's highly convenient for the brass of the Post. It allows the paper to feel more comfortable about its passion for checking Trump's thousands of lies. Trump era has forced the mainstream media to rethink its approach to covering the White House because of the willingness of Trump to lie so fragrantly, so fragrantly, and so flagrantly. Just recently, Trump utterly fabricated Chinese trade talks, and his aides later admitted that not only had he done so, but he had also made it up in order to juice the stock market. Okay, so there's much of this that Grimm talks about here, and I'll leave that for you to read. But not only Trump is complaining about this, and the Republicans. But it's nice for the Post to have a cushion of both sides in the face of getting accusations from the Trump side that they have a liberal bias. And so the Post is reveling in bringing forth fact checks on Senator Bernie Sanders. And the anger comes back from Bernie Sanders and his backers, and that serves the purpose of the Post very nicely, according to Ryan Grimm. Earlier this summer, Sanders suggested that his lousy coverage at the Post might have something to do with his criticism of, and also the legislative efforts, his legislative efforts, targeting Amazon. In 2018, he introduced the Stop Bezos Act to shame the company's CEO, Jeff Bezos, for the low wages he pays workers, contractors, and subcontractors. And Bezos responded by announcing a wage hike. Barron responded to Sanders' general charge, going straight to the refuge most favored by journalists in response to criticism, noting that other people of other political persuasions have also complained, as if this were proof that their criticisms were justified. I mean, maybe they smear everybody, right? And quote, Senator Sanders is a member of a large club of politicians of every ideology who complain about their coverage, Mr. Barron said. And quote, again, contrary to the conspiracy theory the senator seems to favor, Jeff Bezos allows our newsroom to operate with full independence, as our reporters and editors can attest, unquote. Which means, in other words, that Bezos never says anything knowing full well that he doesn't have to if a reporter wants to get ahead at the Washington Post. How many critical articles of Bezos have you seen coming from the Washington Post, anybody? I don't recall seeing a one since he took over the Post. Anyway, Ryan was asking Barron about the beef between Kessler and Sanders. Barron said he was standing behind his fact checker again, noting that people on all sides have a problem with the work of Kessler and his team. And he said, I am extremely proud of the fact checker team, which has been widely recognized for its very difficult, rigorous, and impartial work over many years. Inevitably, they catch fire from individuals across the political spectrum. That comes with the territory. I was on vacation, but I promised the campaign a response from the newsroom. I was among the editors who reviewed and approved the response to Sanders' campaign. I believe it forthrightly explained the fact-checkers' reasoning. I know firsthand that they go about their work honestly and honorably and without any ideological agenda, and they have performed a real service. Now, I want to note here, about this, that a fact checker can offer reasoning behind his evaluation of a factual statement. That doesn't mean, though, that the reasoning is non-ideological. It can be extensive reasoning and be full of ideological presuppositions. It can even be full of inferences that are clearly biased in the sense that the conclusions really don't follow from the premises, that there are logical leaps in it, or that the assumptions in back of the conclusions actually assume what they eventually prove. And it may also be that the fact checkers are perfectly honest about what their ideological presuppositions are. Of course, if they are perfectly honest about it, then they still might have, an ideological agenda. And if they're not honest about it, then they can still have, an ideological agenda. The only way to show they don't have an ideological agenda is to critique their reasoning and have others critique it, and have all the critiques fail to uncover an ideological agenda. And even then, you can't be sure there isn't, an ideological agenda, because these things are not certain. All you can say is, as far as you know, there isn't, an ideological agenda. Anyway, Bernie later backtracked about the specific charge that Bezos himself is responsible for the coverage that Bernie gets in the Post, and for good reason. What Bernie's charge suggests is Bezos specifically is the problem, rather than the structural pressures that push the corporate media in a direction hostile to the left. No progressive would seriously suggest that the Post was somehow sympathetic to the left before Bezos bought the paper in 2013. And then Grimm quotes the idea of manufacturing consent. The book had manufacturing consent. I believe it's a book. After all, was published 25 years before 2013. But Grimm then says, but something has changed in that time. Well, it's true that Kessler's fact checker checks the facts of both the right and the left. It is not true that both sides complain equally. The Trump White House, Grimm points out, has long since stopped concerning itself with fact checkers. In this, Trump is walking the ground trod in 2012 by Mitt Romney's presidential campaign. Quote, we're not going to let our campaign be dictated by fact checkers, unquote. Neil Newhouse, a Romney pollster, declared. In fact, Trump has capitalized on casting the media as an unpopular and untrustworthy institution. For Trump, public battles between the media and the White House are advantageous being on the opposite side of whatever Chuck Todd or Chris Cuomo think is presumed solid political ground. Yes, I think that's a really solid. I think that is a really solid political ground because Chuck Todd and Chris Cuomo are often so very biased in their view towards a centrist position, towards an establishment consensus, that I don't think the political ground on which they stand is solid, okay, at all. Okay. It reeks of holes in logic. It reeks of myth. It reeks of factual errors. What they say on a day-to-day basis is completely untrustworthy. The stories they tell you of what's happening in Venezuela, or what's going on in Syria, or what's going on in China, or the attitudes of the rest of the world towards the United States, they're all off base. When it comes to economics, they're ignoramuses. For that matter, when it comes to policy, they're ignoramuses. The only thing they're not that way on is what the mainstream in Washington thinks about something. They know that very well because they conform to it all the time. And they help to set the consensus. Anyway, Grimm says Trump loves to be on the business end, okay, of media criticism, while the media is uncomfortable in leveling the criticism at him because they're worried about charges of bias, okay, and imbalance. That's been going on for a long time. The right wing has launched an offensive at the media back in the 1970s. And ever since then, the liberal media, quote unquote, which has not been liberal now for a very, very long time, probably not since the 1970s, is very sensitive to criticism from the right and is always backing off from those criticisms. So Grimm says now, to balance things out, the media needs to hit somebody else besides Trump. Since Trump is telling all these lies, and the fact checkers have to keep track of all these lies, and they're so energetic at keeping track of all the lies. They have to balance the scales between Trump's lies and his opponents on the other side. But as Grimm says, that's a fool's errand. So a tweet is quoted by one, I think it's AP Politics, Peter Stern. And there's an AP fact check. Democrats put the blame for the shutdown on Trump, but it takes two to tango. Trump's demand for $5.7 billion for his border wall is one reason for the budget impasse. The Democrats' refusal to approve the money is another. That's supposed to be a fact check? Sure, if the Democrats simply gave in to Trump on the border wall, there wouldn't be a budget impasse. And in that sense, it does take two to tango. But there's the question of who's making an unreasonable demand supported by only a small minority of the American people, and whose opinion is in line with the vast majority of the American people. The evidence is, from the polling, that this isn't a question of being fair to both sides. It's a question of Trump's being unreasonable about the $5.7 billion for the border wall. And the Democrats are being reasonable in opposing the border wall. In fact, they would have been reasonable in opposing it much more strongly than they have. Anyway, at the Post, that particular errand, that is the fool's errand, belongs institutionally to Kessler and his team of two deputies, Salvador Rizzo and Meg Kelly, whose favorite punching bag has clearly become Bernie Sanders. And Grimm says Sanders is the perfect foil because his online defenders are the most rambunctious in the Democratic primary. Yeah, people like me. And Kessler is so blatant at what he does that he has managed to rally hardcore Sanders detractors to Sanders' defense. Then there's a quote from someone who regrets that he's been made to agree with David Sirota, who's a part of Sanders' campaign right now, and is a critic on the progressive side, a very trenchant one. But anyway, he's been made to agree with Sirota because in his fact checking, what Glenn Kessler has evidently unintentionally done has established that a statement that says that millions of people do X, it's actually established by the fact checkers that millions of people do X. But still, the fact checkers are criticizing the statement that millions of people do X. Then Grimm says Kessler has discovered the more ideologically driven the fact check, the more fury and the more hate clicks it draws. And the more that people savage Kessler's fact checks of Sanders, the easier it is for Kessler and the Post to justify his focus on Trump. So you see the process. Okay, there's a process there. The more fury that's driven by the fact check, the more that people savage the fact checks, the easier it is for Kessler and the Post to justify all their attention being paid to all the lies that Trump tells. Because the Post will just go back and say, hey, we're not biased. We focus on Trump all the time. And look at how angry the left is at us because we focus on fact-checking Sanders all the time, too. But that's not the definition of bias. Where bias comes in is whether the fact checks of Sanders are honest checks as opposed to whether they are ideology checks. I'm here to tell you that these checks come from the ideology of Kessler and his team, that they don't come from the facts. They come from Kessler's interpretation of those facts. Now, Kessler has been plying his trade now since 2007. In 2007, Obama was a frequent focus of his political re-education attempts. Grimm says this led to a laugh-out-loud moment in which Kessler dished out 4 Pinocchios, that being a reference to the rating system that Kessler is using for what he considers to be misleading statements. So he dished out 4 Pinocchios for a fact statement that the Post itself put on its front page. How do you like that? He gave 4 Pinocchios to Obama for a factual statement when the Post itself was putting it on its front page. That is, the Post was making the same factual statement on its own front page. So Kessler was actually giving 4 Pinocchios to the Post also. But of course, it took the critics to call attention to this. In a 2012 election ad, Obama's campaign charged, running for governor, Mitt Romney campaigned as a job creator, but as a corporate raider, he shipped jobs to China and Mexico. As a governor, he did the same thing, outsourcing state jobs to India. That was a quote, actually, from the Obama campaign. To back up the claim, the Obama campaign sent Kessler reams of Security and Exchange Commission documents. But Kessler found them unpersuasive and rated the claim, which was true, according to Ryan Grim, and I agree, I think it was true, as a 4 Pinocchio lie that Obama was supposed to have told. The Obama campaign also sent the FCC documents to an actual Post reporter who studied them on the same day Kessler published his fact check. June 21st of 2012, the Post reporter published a front page story headline, quote, Rhonda's Bain Capital invested in companies that move jobs overseas, quote, citing China and India in the first line. Kessler never even updated his item to note that he was in fervent disagreement with his own paper's reporters and editors. You can't write this. I mean, no one would believe that you wrote this in a novel. It's too ridiculous. In 2015, Kessler dismissed the Sanders claim about job losses. Sanders cited CBO numbers showing that budget caps would cost the economy 1.4 million jobs. Kessler responded, it was unfair for Sanders to use the CBO's high estimate, and that the number should be cut in half because the CBO is talking about 2 years. So Kessler pulled the number down to 300,000 and dismissed it as inconsequential. Now you tell me that there was no ideology involved in that process, that there was no ideological presupposition about wanting to minimize that claim of Sanders. Okay, now don't get me wrong. If Kessler had gone out and had been honest and had said, look, the CBO can't tell whether the budget caps are going to cost the economy 1.4 million jobs because their ability to project is nil. And I got all kinds of evidence to show that. And if Kessler had presented his evidence of how often the CBO is wrong, then he might have dismissed a Sanders claim, but he could not in that instance call it a lie because Sanders was obviously not trying to lie. He was just trying to go with the source, which in Washington is often an unimpeachable source in connection with, almost everybody agrees except for outsiders like myself who note that the CBO is constantly making mistakes and is not accurately able to project out even 3 months without revising its projections. As when, for example, it comes up halfway through the fiscal year nearly with a projection in February of a particular fiscal year, and then has to revise the projection in June of that year, 3 months before the end of the fiscal year. It has to revise the projection because it's already been made a lie of by events. But anyway, the rules of the game in Washington is you can cite the CBO's estimate in support of your case without being called a liar by anybody. Now, it might be, completely okay to say you disagree with the CBO. But when a politician is citing the CBO and relying on the CBO, you generally don't claim that they're deliberately lying. In other words, they shouldn't be getting 4 Pinocchios or 3 Pinocchios. If you disagree with it and you can put forward good grounds for why you disagree with it, then maybe if those grounds are really obvious, you might want to give them a Pinocchio, or you might want to say, I'm not going to give anybody a Pinocchio here because they're relying on a generally accepted source, but in fact, we believe that this particular projection is factually incorrect, and here are our reasons why. That would be perfectly acceptable for Kessler to do. But the truth is, his team doesn't have the capability to put forward such a criticism. That's the truth. Another uncomfortable fact, an inconvenient truth. Quote, here's another bit of context on those 300,000 additional workers. The U.S. economy gained nearly 450,000 employees just in the months of June and July, quote, he wrote. In context and properly counted, it's a real stretch to speak of enormous job losses, unquote. Now that may or may not be, in other words, that sounds like a logical argument, but I suspect that when CBO made the projection it did, that CBO was taking into account, okay, in its projections, that it was taking account of any additional workers that would be getting jobs as a result of the policies of the government. So that cost the economy 1.4 million jobs is, in most of the contexts for CBO, is a net estimate. So if the U.S. economy gained nearly 450,000 employees just in the months of June and July, there was no net loss, but a net gain of 450,000 in those 2 months, then maybe there's a basis for criticizing Sanders because he relied on the CBO. But then Kessler ought to be clear about it and should be critiquing the CEO and not Sanders. Anyway, that was just the first 2 months. Okay, so the projection was a 2-year projection. So the fact that the economy gained 450,000 in 2 months doesn't invalidate the projection of the CBO. It probably was wrong, but it doesn't invalidate, the projection. Okay, any economist will tell you that. So, as Grimm says here, the assessment was an economically ignorant one. And of course, it was ridiculed. And Grimm points out, clicks successfully driven to the post. Then he says, but the firestorm protest has risen to its highest levels yet in the heat of the 2020 presidential campaign. Former Representative Mr. Beto O'Rourke got the ideological treatment during the second Democratic debate when he asserted, quote, wind and solar jobs are the fastest growing jobs in the country. But Kelly, on Kessler's team, reported that the Bureau of Labor Statistics indeed projects solar photovoltaic installers and wind turbine technicians will grow the fastest between 2016 and 2026, unquote. And Grimm, I think, correctly points out, if Kessler's operation were dedicated to checking facts only, the item would have ended there. O'Rourke had made a claim. The claim checks out. everyone moves on and sees what happens. But Kelly, however, did not move on. Her next sentence, quote, "But that doesn't mean they are common professions." Huh? Kelly went on to note that wind and solar jobs are, quote, "a minuscule percentage of the total 167.6 million people who are employed." And Grimm says, "Sure, except, of course, O'Rourke never said otherwise. He just said that they'll grow the fastest between 2016 and 2026. So what's the point of adding that if it's a minuscule percentage of the total 167.6 million people who are employed? It's still growing the fastest, right? And people who have jobs in the fossil fuel industry, while a larger percentage, are still a pretty small percentage of the total 167.6 million people who are employed. So what? In July, Kessler dug into a Sanders statement that, quote, "right now, 500,000 Americans are sleeping out on the street, and yet companies like Amazon that made billions of profits and did not pay a nickel in federal income tax." And Kessler grudgingly allowed the first part of Sanders' sentence is true, or at least was true, on one night. Oops. And then he says, quote, "Sanders' number comes from a single night survey done by the Department of Housing and Urban Development for a single night in January of 2018. The estimate was 553,000 people." So Sanders rounded the estimate down to 500,000, giving the benefit of the doubt to the people who think the number is a lot smaller by giving away 53,000. Does Kessler really think that over the next month or in the month just before that the estimate was significantly different from the 553,000? Or that 3 months from then it was 553,000? I mean, come on, let's be real here. These numbers don't change that rapidly. Sanders was being cautious in giving an approximation of 500,000. That statement is probably, in a fuzzy sense, a true statement. From there, Kessler moved on, recasting Sanders' statement about Amazon into a broader conversation about corporate taxes and using language that reflects a pro-business ideology. Sure, because this is an ideology check, not a fact check. Quote, "Sanders has a point that large corporations, including Amazon, use many tools and strategies to substantially cut down their tax bill, but they do pay some taxes," unquote. Did Sanders say that they don't pay any taxes? I believe Sanders was talking about corporate income taxes. Was he not? Seems to me that was the context. They do pay some taxes. Yeah, they pay sales taxes sometimes. Though I don't think Amazon paid sales taxes for years, but that's another story. He then gave space to the Anti-Tax Foundation to note that at times over the years, Amazon has indeed paid some taxes. Yeah. Kessler never informed the reader of what a simple Google search turns out. Amazon paid no federal income taxes in 2018. So then, He's performing this ideology check on Sanders, and Ryan Grimm is performing an ideology check, okay, on Kessler. He's saying, look, any honest person looking at the real factual situation would have mentioned that Amazon paid no federal taxes in 2018. So basically, what Ryan is saying here is, Glenn Kessler, why didn't you point that out? Was it too short a sentence for you? Instead, Kessler wrote, quote, the Wall Street Journal reported in June that it's not clear whether Amazon paid taxes in 2018, unquote. What? What weasel wording that is. What weasel wording that is. A Google search turned up at the time the thing was published. A Google search turned up Amazon paid no federal income taxes in 2018. Who cares what the Wall Street Journal reported in June? Who cares? What's the difference? Who needs to be fact-checked now? Earlier that month, Kessler had protested Sanders' assertion that 3 people in this country own more wealth than the bottom half of America. Kessler acknowledged that, quote, this snappy talking point is based on numbers that add up, unquote. But as usual, Kessler wasn't finished. The statement compared apples to oranges, quote unquote, he argued, because, quote, people in the bottom half have essentially no wealth as debts cancel out whatever assets they might have, unquote. So, why is that particularly relevant? Why is that a distortion on Sanders' part? That's part of the point. So many people in the bottom half have no wealth, no net wealth. That's why, one of the reasons why 3 people in this country own more wealth than the bottom half. Kessler is smart enough to know the explicit suggestion that rich people and poor people simply can't be compared to each other is wildly offensive, especially in a nation that fancies itself not to have rigid class distinctions. But such an outrageous claim is good for business and led to the expected outcry from Sanders supporters. Of course it did, because Kessler was being dishonest. In making that claim, he was being dishonest. He was being unfair. He was being ideological. He was being fraudulent because he's not a fact checker. He's a fraud. When Sanders claimed that, quote, millions of Americans are forced to work 2 or 3 jobs just to survive, unquote, Kessler checked it and found it to be true. The Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that nearly 8 million people hold more than 1 job. Kessler confirmed what Sanders had said, yet he went on. But most of those extra jobs are part-time, not full-time. And the millions of people amount to just 5% of Americans with jobs. So that means 95% of workers are not working 2 or 3 jobs just to survive, making this, okay, a misleading statement, unquote. Well, I don't see why the statement is misleading. There are millions of people, nearly 8 million people hold more than 1 job. There are millions of people. Even if they're just 5% of Americans with jobs, there are millions of people who hold 2 and 3 jobs just to survive. What's misleading about that? It's part of Kessler's pattern. Sanders makes a claim. Kessler finds it to be factual, but still condemns it, in many cases simply because he doesn't think it's a meaningful claim. Wind and solar aren't big enough to count. A few 100,000 jobs lost is just meh. Yes, millions is correct, but it's not really that big a number. The point is that when Kessler gives context to a factual claim, he chooses his context to minimize the seriousness of Sanders' claim. He always minimizes it. He never sets a context in such a way that it sets the context pointing in a different way. Why not? Because Kessler is performing an ideological check, an ideology check, on behalf of his neoliberal masters. Kessler is a neoliberal ideologue performing ideology checks that bolster the position of the establishment. That's what is going on here. When Sanders noted that Wall Street had gotten $1 trillion bailout, a number that far undershoots the real figure. Yeah, Wall Street has gotten. There was an academic study that showed in 2012 that the credit facilities that had been made use of by the banks in the post-crash period in order for the banks to recover was $29 trillion as of 2012. That was an academic study. It's 2019 now. The banks are still using some of those credit facilities. It's likely the bailout was 35 trillion or 40 trillion or 45 trillion in credit facilities used continuously by these Wall Street banks, by the very large commercial banks. And Grimm says it's a number that far undershoots the real figure according to the Government Accountability Office. Kessler said it was false, decreeing that money from the Federal Reserve to bail out a bank is not bailout money. Then what is it? Okay, then what is it? If the Federal Reserve makes money available to banks by trading assets with them, when the assets involved have no market value at a particular time or little market value at a particular time, when they're no longer marked to market, and the assets at the time of the trade are worth much less than what they're purported to be worth on a balance sheet, and the Fed gives them newly created reserves instead, as was done with respect to quantitative easing. When that happens, isn't it actually bailout money? When Sanders said that Hitler won an election, Kessler called him a liar and was promptly lampooned by everybody else in existence. You are cherry-picking lines that support your thesis rather than looking at the full text of the works, said Washington Post spokesperson Christine Corradi. The Washington Post spokesperson said herself, you are cherry-picking lines that support your thesis. Kessler also sometimes turns to experts associated with big business. Oh yeah, this was one great example. In August, just this past August, the fact checker team landed back in the social media barrel when it questioned Sanders' citation of a peer reviewed editorial in the American Journal of Public Health, or the AJPH, which is probably the leading public health journal in the world, saying that, quote, 500,000 Americans will go bankrupt this year from their medical bills. The author of the editorial, David Himmelstein, who was for some time a professor, okay, at Harvard, who's now a professor at the City University, okay, of New York, who's an MD himself, came to Sanders' defense, saying that Sanders had correctly characterized his findings. Okay, now to be above board, Himmelstein and Sanders have been working in concert now for years. But that doesn't change the fact that Sanders correctly characterized the finding, okay, of Himmelstein. So in this case, Kessler has decided to do is to question Himmelstein's finding. And one of Kessler's team, Salvador Rizzo, also claimed the editorial was not actually peer reviewed, which turned out to be a false claim. It was peer reviewed. Stunningly, in order to refute Himmelstein, the fact checker turned to an analyst who cut his teeth with a tobacco lobby front group. Craig Garthwaite is described by Rizzo as, quote, a healthcare policy expert in the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern. Garthwaite argues that because many people have medical debt who do not go bankrupt, the study is flawed. What does that have to do with the price of eggs? 500,000 people per year who do have medical debt do go bankrupt, in part because of the medical debt. That's a terrible problem. I mean, even if 1 million people who have medical debt do not go bankrupt, even if 5 million people who have medical debt do not go bankrupt, even if 10 million people who have medical debt also do not go bankrupt, it's a terrible problem when 500,000 people who have medical debt go bankrupt. Okay, so Garthwaite is saying that in order to get a better idea of the causality involved, you have to have a sample of people who go bankrupt and see how many have medical debt. Well, I'm not at this point. I can't quote off the top of my head how many people go bankrupt every year, but I'm going to estimate off the top of my head now. I haven't actually looked this up. That there are probably 3 or 4 million people in the United States who go bankrupt each year. If there are 500,000 people who go bankrupt, partly as a result of the fact that they have medical debt, That's a very high percentage, okay, of people. That should give you an idea that medical debt is one of the leading causes, okay, of bankruptcy. So then Grimm says, okay, imagine claiming because millions of people use heroin without overdosing, you can't make any claims of causality between heroin and overdoses. He says it's such a tangentious argument that it makes you wonder what's going on with the expert. Makes you wonder whether the expert, okay, is an expert. A look at his bio shows Garthwaite was previously director of research for the Employment Policies Institute. And so then Grimm says, to allow him, Garthwaite, to adjudicate the Sanders claim is not much different than going directly to the insurance industry. Why? Because the Employment Policies Institute is one that in part is heavily supported by the insurance industry. So, does the selection of Garthwaite show an ideological bias on the part, okay, of Rizzo, okay, and Kessler? In other words, does this allow us to suspect, an ideology check is going on here and not a fact check? I think so. So Grimm goes on. EPI is a right wing front operated by notorious corporate PR man Richard Berman, who ran an infamous tobacco industry propaganda campaign. As the New York Times reported in 2014, Berman has repeatedly created official sounding nonprofit groups like the Center for Consumer Freedom that have challenged limits like the ban on indoor smoking and the push to restrict calorie counts in fast foods, unquote. EPI, the Times writes, was, quote, most often described only as a nonprofit research organization, but in practice was indiscernible from the for-profit firm. Quote, the sign at the entrance is for Berman and Company, as the Employment Policy Institute has no employees of its own. Mr. Berman's for-profit advertising firm instead bills the nonprofit institute for the services his employees provide to the institute. Isn't that a close connection? Would you say they're sharing the same bed? Warming up, Berman's man drops the hammer on Sanders' claim. Quote, it's wrong. It's just wrong. Just because the number's big doesn't make it right, even if you want to agree with the premise. And we should be careful about this. I'm not saying medical debt and bankruptcy is not a problem, but I think we should have a conversation about the appropriate scale of the problem. All I have to say about that is, buddy, if the problem involves 500,000 going bankrupt each and every year, that's a significant social problem without even discussing the full context. But if you want to discuss the full context, it's a simple matter to Google a number of bankruptcies in the United States each year and then look at the scale of the problem. In fact, I admit I should have done that actually myself. But I'll tell you one thing. I know for a fact that Himmelstein knows what that particular number is because besides the other things he does, he writes about bankruptcies in the United States too. In fact, I read his article at one point. It may very well have mentioned the number of bankruptcies in the United States annually. I wouldn't be a bit surprised. I suspect it did. But anyway, The total number of non-business bankruptcies in 2016, which I have in front of me right now based on consumer bankruptcy filings, the total number of non-business bankruptcies in 2016 was, let me get this for you, 781,123. In 2017, it was 767,721, slightly less, than that. And those were Chapter 7 non-business bankruptcies. There were also Chapter 13 non-business bankruptcies, and that was another 295,000. So if we look at total both the Chapter 7 and Chapter 13 bankruptcies, we're probably talking about 1.1 million bankruptcies in 2017. And guess what? Roughly 500,000 of those are in part due to medical debt. So I'd say that's the context for the problem. Half the annual bankruptcies are due to medical debt. Right? Right. So, the fact checker never noted Garthwaite's ideological or professional priors. Himmelstein didn't get the same benefit of the doubt. Rizzo characterizes him as a professor at CUNY's Hunter College who supports single-payer health care. He does support single-payer health care. In fact, he's one of the founders of the Physicians for a National Health Program, the PNHP, which is one of the major organizations in favor of a Medicare for All bill. But nevertheless, Himmelstein wrote an editorial that was peer-reviewed for the AJPH, and his politics was described by the fact checker. But the former research director for a corporate front group did not have his politics described by the fact checker. And Grimm says that's another case of the fact checker's ideology showing through. And then he says ideology is more effective when it is invisibly presented. But nevertheless, it's an ideology check, folks. It's not a fact check. So the fact checker awarded Sanders and the AJPH 3 Pinocchios. Okay, so then Grimm goes on to talk about the case of how differently the Post treated Charles Blauhaus, who was a researcher at the Koch-funded Mercatus Center. Now, I'm not going to go through that. I'm going to leave that, to you to go through because I spent enough time on this. But you get the point. Every time there's a fact check, of Sanders, every single time there's a fact check, of Sanders, Kessler's ideology and the ideology of his team and the neoliberal bias that his team has shows through every time. And the Post never responds favorably to complaints they're being sued now by Himmelstein, who says that their statement that his article was not a peer-reviewed article besmirched his the reputation, okay, of Himmelstein, and he has asked for a retraction. But Kessler stood by the fact check, and he elicited widespread scorn. And he did. He elicited exactly widespread scorn. So I'll let you continue with the rest of the article, but I think the point, okay, is made. And I'm not going to make it further. The fact checker, the Washington Post, is an ideology checker. His work reeks of ideology, and not just an ideology. It reeks of a neoliberal establishment type, okay, of ideology. One completely dedicated to maintaining the status quo in American society. It is rotten with that. So, I'm going to take a look at your comments now, since I've certainly spent enough time on this. And I thank you for staying with me, those who have had the patience to do so. Okay, so let's see what you've had to say all through this. Laura says, sounds better. Russell Gorman has joined. Jim Sturr says, keep on pushing. And Steve says, in my humble opinion, the Washington Post is a CIA propaganda arm. And Lana Dell has joined. Are there any more? Okay, I see 11 of you good folks are still out there. So, I'm going to remember to sit up straight now, everybody. Okay, are there any more comments? Okay, if there are not, then I want to let you know that I'll probably be discussing tomorrow night an article by Katie Johnstone on the UBI, okay, and automation, plutocracy, and also dystopia. I also may be going over, okay, an article from the Times from September 4th that had comments on the Bernie Green New Deal plan, and so they had comments on whether it was likely to create the jobs, okay, it promised. And that was one of the stupidest critiques that I've ever seen. It's so simple to refute. It is not funny. So I'll probably be talking about those two things tomorrow night. Until then, please remember to share, like, and subscribe. And I hope that occasionally you will visit my Patreon page, www.patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. Okay, and remember, you can sign up there for a monthly contribution. Okay, or you can sign up there for a one-time contribution. There's a way to do a one-time contribution there as well. So feel free to go there, and remember, every dollar helps to live streamers like myself who are trying to keep the lights on. So please keep that in mind. And okay, I'll wish you, if there are no further comments, I'll wish you a very good night. Rich Serber has joined. And Russell says, interesting show. Thanks, Russell. Margot says, I look forward to tomorrow's talk. Thank you, Margot. And Margot says, thanks for tonight. Okay, so good night, everybody. Okay, I'm now going to end the stream.